Welcome to the Deep Dive podcast channel.
Hello.
Today, we're venturing into a territory many of you have actually reached out about.
hmm
It's about the surprisingly long reach of our earliest emotional landscapes. Specifically, how childhood emotional neglect, those often invisible experiences, can shape our adult love lives.
It really is powerful stuff.
Yeah, it's almost humbling, isn't it? To think how feelings we might not even consciously recall can, well, cast such a big influence on our deepest connections.
Definitely.
So if this resonates with you, or if you're just keen to understand more about relationship dynamics, we'd be really glad if you'd subscribe. We've got more explorations like this planned.
And as we navigate this sensitive terrain today, please know that our aim is really to create a space where you feel safe to reflect and learn.
Absolutely.
There's a universal human experiences, really. And understanding them with compassion, well, that's a first step toward growth, isn't it?
It really is. And your insights, your questions in the comments, they're invaluable. So please do share your thoughts. We'll also be getting to some of the frequently asked questions we've received on this topic a little later on.
Great. So maybe let's start by getting really clear on what we actually mean by childhood emotional neglect.
Okay.
Because it's often misunderstood. It's not typically about the obvious wounds, bruises or overt abuse.
Right.
It's more about the absence of something, a lack of consistent emotional attunement, a caregiver's genuine presence, that feeling of having your inner world mirrored and validated.
Maybe it being truly seen emotionally.
Exactly, like a caregiver being really in tune with a child's emotional state, sort of gently mirroring their feelings back to them.
Right. It's those quieter moments, often unspoken, that can leave such a lasting mark, like being told, maybe even with good intentions, oh, you're just too sensitive,
Yeah, that's a classic example.
which can kind of inadvertently teach a child that their feelings are wrong somehow.
Not too much, yeah.
Or that feeling of just shouting into the void, not being truly seen or heard within your own family.
Mm.
Maybe being left to handle big emotional storms alone, subtly learning that your feelings were like a problem you should keep to yourself.
Precisely. And what's interesting here, and often makes it hard to identify, is that unlike more overt maltreatment, emotional neglect can be very silent,
Yeah.
almost invisible. It's often chronic, but not necessarily dramatic day to day. Yet, its impact on a person's fundamental sense of self-worth
Huge.
and their ability to form deep, secure connections later on, it can be really profound.
It really makes you think, if those foundational experiences, having your emotional world acknowledged, validated if they're missing, it seems almost inevitable you'd grow up with this lingering sense that maybe your inner life doesn't quite matter, or that it's flawed somehow.
Exactly. Children are like natural sponges. They internalize the messages they receive, or in the case of neglect, the messages they don't receive.
Right.
So they might unconsciously conclude my emotional needs are too much, or there must be something wrong with me for even having these needs.
And that, I imagine, just ripples outwards into so many parts of adult life, especially intimacy.
Absolutely.
It could fuel that persistent self-doubt, maybe a deep current of shame, or like a tendency to become hyper-focused on everyone else's needs just to feel okay yourself.
Yes, or sometimes the opposite.
Oh.
On the other side of the coin, maybe a kind of protective emotional shutdown,
Mhm.
a numbness that just keeps potential pain away.
Ah, okay. Like a defense mechanism.
All of those are incredibly common and really understandable adaptations. And it's just so crucial to reframe these responses.
How so?
Well, not as personal failings, but as quite ingenious survival mechanisms, developed in an environment where that emotional sustenance was, well, lacking. The psyche is remarkably resourceful.
That shift in perspective, seeing it as adaptation, not failure, that feels really important.
It is.
And it leads us naturally to think about how these unmet childhood needs then play out in adult romance, sometimes in ways that feel, I don't know, almost paradoxical, like this intense craving.
Precisely. That absence of early emotional nourishment, it can definitely transform adult relationships into this sometimes unconscious but very potent quest.
A quest for what, specifically?
To finally feel chosen, to feel truly seen, in your entirety, and to feel fundamentally safe at your emotional core, that deep longing to have those early unmet needs finally met.
Yeah.
It can become a really powerful, almost magnetic force in romance.
And that intensity, that almost hunger for connection and validation, that could so easily be mistaken for real intimacy, couldn't it?
Absolutely. It's a very common pitfall.
Like the sheer force of the feeling makes it seem like the bond must be incredibly strong.
Yes. That initial spark, the intensity, the urgency, it can feel incredibly compelling, like This is it, this profound bond.
But underneath?
But often, what's lurking underneath is a deep-seated fear of abandonment being triggered. That almost frantic desire to hold on to the other person can stem from a very primal anxiety, really, of being left alone with those unresolved childhood vulnerabilities.
Okay, so how do we start to tell the difference between that maybe desperate clinging born of need and what we'd call healthy love? What are the signs we might be operating from that place of old wounds?
That's a critical distinction. Romantic obsession, it's often characterized by an emotional entanglement that really consumes a huge chunk of your thoughts and energy.
Mm-hmm.
Your sense of self-worth gets tangled up, almost inextricably linked to the other person's approval, their attention, their affection.
Right. We've probably all seen or maybe even felt some of those signs, like constantly replaying interactions in your head.
Oh yes, ruminating.
Or feeling just disproportionately distressed if you don't hear back quickly. Or spending loads of time fantasizing about a future maybe way too early on.
Exactly. Other red flags might include putting the person on an unrealistic pedestal, idealizing them so much you ignore their flaws,
Uh-huh.
and often overlooking clear warning signs or problematic behaviors simply because the fear of losing that connection, however fragile it might be, is just too overwhelming. And like we touched on, at the heart of this, so often, is that inner child, still desperately yearning to be chosen, to finally feel worthy.
And how does that contrast with healthy love? What are the core qualities of a more secure, balanced connection?
Well, healthy love fundamentally is built on mutual respect.
Okay.
There's a genuine recognition of each other's individuality, their autonomy. There's respect for personal space, for boundaries. Communication tends to be open, honest. Boundaries are clear, respected.
It sounds more grounded.
It is. It's rooted in reality and who the person actually is, strengths and imperfections included, not an idealized projection. The feeling underneath is more like we're growing together side by side. Instead of that fear-driven, please don't leave me, I won't survive without you. That distinction, I think, really captures the essence.
That's powerful. Growing together versus I won't survive. It highlights such different motivations. And this seems to link up really closely with attachment theory, doesn't it? Especially anxious attachment.
It really does. Attachment theory gives us such a useful framework for understanding how those early caregiving experiences shape our relating patterns as adults, especially in our closest relationships.
And anxious attachment comes from?
Well, when early caregiving is inconsistent, maybe unpredictable, or when affection feels conditional, not freely given, that can significantly increase the likelihood of developing an anxious attachment style.
Okay. And what does that look like in adult romantic relationships? What are the key behaviors?
People with an anxious attachment style often carry a deep, pervasive fear of abandonment.
Mm-hmm.
They might frequently seek reassurance from their partners, sometimes, quite intensely, which can feel overwhelming to the other person.
Yeah.
There can also be a tendency to blur boundaries, almost merge identities with their partner.
Mm-hmm.
And often there's this persistent underlying feeling of just not being okay when they're alone or feel any distance in the relationship.
So in that state, love can really feel almost vital for emotional survival. Because those basic needs for consistent care, reassurance, security, they weren't reliably met early on.
Precisely. It's not about being needy in a negative way. It's that fundamental needs for safety and security in connection weren't consistently addressed during development. This creates a deep vulnerability that, understandably, plays out later.
And then there's this interesting idea of fantasy bonds. That sounds like another way our minds try to create closeness when maybe the real thing is missing.
Yes, that concept from Dr. Robert Firestone describes these illusions of connection, illusions of closeness that we can develop as a kind of substitute for genuine, authentic, emotional intimacy.
Like a stand-in.
Almost, yeah. It's like we construct this mental image of the relationship that gives a superficial sense of security, an emotional counterfeit, if you will. And interestingly, sometimes these fantasy bonds can feel more secure than real intimacy because they're entirely within our control, which is a tragic echo of the powerlessness often felt in childhood neglect.
Wow, that idea of control offering false security is really striking. Can you give some examples of what a fantasy bond might look like day to day?
Certainly. It might mean quickly deciding someone is the one very early on, even before you really know them deeply, or consistently misinterpreting intense longing or infatuation for genuine love. It can also show up as staying in unhealthy or unfulfilling relationships because you're attached to the potential, the what could be fantasy, rather than facing the reality of what is.
It sounds like projecting this perfect, nurturing figure onto the other person, unconsciously trying to get the parenting we missed.
Exactly. That over-idealization in a fantasy bond often serves as an unconscious attempt to finally create that consistently present, unconditionally loving, attuned caregiver that was missing.
This all seems to keep coming back to the inner child. How does that younger, maybe wounded part of us keep influencing our adult romance, often without us even knowing?
Well, the emotionally underdeveloped parts of ourselves, often called the inner child, can definitely exert a powerful influence, especially in moments when we feel triggered, vulnerable, or when our core needs for love and security feel threatened.
And what might that actually look like in, say, an argument or just daily interactions?
It can manifest in different ways. Maybe emotional regression during conflict, finding yourself reacting with intense, childlike emotions like overwhelming fear or anger that seem way out of proportion.
Okay.
There might be a deep, almost insatiable craving to be rescued by a partner or to completely merge with them, blurring healthy boundaries. And as we've talked about, that unconscious projection of unmet childhood needs onto the partner, almost expecting them to magically fix everything.
So in a way, our adult relationships can become this unconscious stage where the inner child is constantly trying to get that earlier repair, that validation that never quite came.
Precisely. The unmet needs and unresolved experiences of the past often seek resolution in the present, and intimate relationships can become a primary arena for replaying those early dynamics, often unconsciously.
And this also seems to echo ideas from object relations theory, right? That we internalize our early caregivers and then project these objects onto partners.
Yes, exactly. Object relations theory suggests we create these internal mental blueprints or representations of our primary caregivers early on. And these internalized images, these objects, profoundly influence how we see and interact with others as adults, especially intimate partners.
So if someone experienced significant emotional neglect, what might their internal world, their gallery of these objects look like?
For someone with that background, their internal world might be populated by figures that feel emotionally distant, unavailable, maybe subtly or even overtly disapproving. Their felt sense of love might be conditional, something earned, not freely given.
And how does that unconsciously shape their choices and behavior in romance?
Well, they might find themselves drawn, again unconsciously, to partners who actually mirror these early internal imprints.
Oh, right, the familiar pattern.
Yes. They might be attracted to partners who are emotionally unavailable, recreating a dynamic that feels familiar, even if it's ultimately painful. They might also interpret their partner's actions through that old lens, maybe anticipating rejection or disapproval, even when it's not intended. They could be relating more to a fantasy built from the past than the actual person in front of them.
That makes so much sense. It's like wearing old glasses that distort how we see the present. So healing must involve, partly, learning to recognize those lenses, maybe even take them off sometimes.
Exactly. Learning to differentiate the past from the present reality of the relationship. And, when we talk about neglect's impact, it's not just psychological. It can have a very real physical effect, too.
On the body, how we experience connection physically.
Yes. Because without that early, consistent co-regulation from attuned caregivers, that mirroring and soothing we talked about, our nervous system might not have fully learned how to settle into states of safe, secure connection.
Ah, okay. So what does that kind of physiological dysregulation look like in adult relationships?
Without that early foundation, the nervous system can become highly reactive.
Mm.
It might default to those primal stress responses, fight, flight, freeze, or even fawn.
Fawn, what's that?
Fawning is essentially people-pleasing to avoid conflict or rejection.
Mm-hmm.
So the nervous system might jump into one of these modes in intimate relationships, even when the situation isn't objectively threatening.
So maybe a partner needing some space triggers a full-blown panic, that fear of abandonment kicking in hard.
Exactly. Or someone might develop a pattern of overfunctioning, constantly trying to anticipate and meet every need to prevent rejection.
Mm-hmm.
And that freeze response, that emotional shutdown or numbness, that can also be a way of coping when feeling overwhelmed or unsafe in the relationship dynamic.
Right. For someone who experienced neglect, love itself can feel inherently dysregulating.
Sometimes, yes, because the nervous system hasn't developed that strong, reliable baseline of feeling truly safe and secure within a close connection. It can trigger these intense survival responses, even in relatively minor situations, making intimacy feel more like a threat than a comfort, paradoxically.
Wow. This paints such a clear picture of why love can feel so challenging, even painful for people with this background. But the crucial question is, what does healing look like? How can someone start to address these wounds and build healthier patterns?
Healing really starts with a conscious, compassionate journey inward, focusing on addressing those unmet childhood needs. A key piece is what we call reparenting the inner child.
Reparenting, what does that actually involve doing?
It involves intentionally learning to speak to yourself with the tenderness, the validation, the reassurance you longed for back then,
Hmm.
offering that younger part of you the emotional support it didn't get, letting that inner child know deep down, you are safe now. Your feelings are okay.
That idea of consciously giving yourself what you missed, that feels incredibly powerful.
And what about emotional regulation? How does learning to manage our own emotions fit in?
Learning to regulate your own emotions effectively in healthy ways is absolutely essential. It means developing skills to soothe distress, manage difficult feelings, find equilibrium without solely relying on a partner for that.
Right. So things like,
Practices like mindfulness, ground techniques, maybe journaling to process feelings, or even just mindful breathing. They can be incredibly helpful in building that capacity for self-soothing. It's not about isolating yourself or becoming totally detached.
no.
It's about cultivating a strong inner sense of self-support within the context of connection.
And you mentioned somatic safety earlier, the body connection. How does healing through the body work here?
Because neglect, like other early adversity, often gets held in the body, not just in thoughts or memories. Healing needs to address that physical dimension.
Things like somatic experiencing, which focuses on body sensations linked to past events, or polyvagal-informed exercises that help regulate the nervous system.
Mm.
Even safe, consensual touch can help cultivate a felt sense of safety in your own body. Safety isn't just an idea, it's an embodied feeling.
A felt sense. I like that. And finally, creating new love maps, consciously shaping how we approach relationships now. What does that look like practically?
Creating new love maps is about being much more intentional, conscious about the partners we choose, actively prioritizing people who show consistency, empathy, reliability, who feel emotionally safe.
Over maybe just excitement or familiarity.
Exactly. Over those who just ignite intense emotions or trigger familiar but ultimately unfulfilling patterns. It involves cultivating clear communication about needs and boundaries, learning to spot red flags and trust your gut when something feels off, and actively building emotional literacy, becoming more aware of your own feelings and needs and how to express them. Ultimately, it's about consciously choosing to build relationships based on mutual respect, trust, shared growth, rather than unconsciously repeating old patterns driven by anxiety. That shift, choosing safety over intensity, can be a real turning point.
That focus on consciously choosing safety over the pull of intensity, that feels huge, potentially life-changing. Now, we did get a number of really insightful questions from listeners. Let's take a moment for those.
Cool.
One that came up a lot. Is romantic obsession basically the same as love addiction?
Ah, good question. Important clarification. While there's definitely overlap in the underlying dynamics, they aren't precisely the same thing.
How so?
Love addiction usually describes a broader pattern compulsively seeking out relationships, often serially. Romantic obsession tends to focus intensely on one specific person as the perceived solution to deep inner pain or unmet needs. The focus of the compulsion is a bit different.
Got it. Okay. Another listener asked a really hopeful question. Can the effects of childhood emotional neglect on adult relationships actually be healed?
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah.
Healing is definitely possible. It takes a conscious effort, willingness to explore those early experiences, often with therapeutic support,
Mm-hmm.
and experiencing secure, healthy relationships in adulthood can also be incredibly healing in itself. It's a journey, for sure, not a quick fix, but positive change is absolutely achievable.
That's good to hear. We also had someone ask why they often find themselves drawn to people who are emotionally unavailable again and again.
Yeah, that's a very common experience. It often stems from an unconscious sense of familiarity.
Familiarity, even if it's painful.
Unfortunately, yes. Emotionally unavailable partners can mirror the emotional landscape of childhood, even if it was neglectful. There's an unconscious pull towards what feels normal, even if it isn't healthy. But as healing progresses and your sense of what feels normal shifts, those attractions can change too.
Are there particular types of therapy that tend to be especially helpful for this?
Yes, several modalities can be really effective. Attachment-based therapy directly addresses those early relational patterns. Inner child work provides space to engage with and heal those younger emotional wounds.
Okay.
And somatic therapies like EMDR, IFS, somatic experiencing can be incredibly helpful for releasing the body-held experiences of neglect and trauma. fostering a greater sense of safety and integration.
Another listener asked something very human. Is it okay to feel needy in relationships?
Oh, absolutely. It's fundamental to being human to have needs for closeness, support, affection in relationships. The goal isn't to eliminate needs.
Right.
It's about learning healthy, effective ways to express and meet them within a context of mutual respect, interdependence, healthy boundaries, vulnerability, asking for what you need that's actually strength. It deepens intimacy.
Good point. And finally, what are some positive signs that someone is healing, moving through this process? What might they notice changing?
Several key things. A big one is finding yourself increasingly drawn to partners who feel genuinely safe, reliable, emotionally available, rather than just exciting but unstable.
Hmm.
You might also notice a greater capacity to self-soothe when distressed, without immediately needing external reassurance. An increased ability to set and hold healthy boundaries. A stronger sense of your own inherent worth, not tied to external validation. Just a greater sense of peace and security within yourself and your relationships. Those are all really positive signs.
It's so important to remember as we wrap up that if any of this discussion resonated deeply with your own experiences, you are truly not alone.
No, you're not.
And the patterns we've talked about are very understandable responses to those early environments.
Healing is definitely an ongoing journey, not some fixed destination. And taking those courageous steps towards understanding yourself and your patterns with compassion, that's a profoundly powerful act of self-care.
Yeah, self-compassion is key. We sincerely hope this deep dive has offered you some valuable insights, maybe a new lens for understanding your own relationships and experiences.
And if you found this discussion helpful, we'd warmly encourage you to subscribe to the Deep Dive channel. We'll have more explorations into the complexities of our inner lives and relationships coming up.
We'd also love to continue the conversation. Please do share your thoughts, any further questions you have down in the comments section below.
Thank you so much for joining us today for this deep dive. We look forward to our next exploration together.